Hello everyone, we are continuing our discussion on the printing technologies and different kind of printing endeavors in the Indian subcontinent during the colonial period. So we have already started talking about the Battala printing in Calcutta, in the city of Calcutta, and with the other characteristic features, one thing we can also see this impressive division of positive and negative areas. So the thing that we have been talking about from the beginning of this week, that how in the relief printmaking, so this is a wood engraving, so it will be printed as this relief printmaking, in which we find the images are made into this raised surface, and then the negative area will be the sunken area. So in this image one can clearly see that, these are the image areas and these are the negative areas. So these are the sunken areas in a wood block. So in this way one can see that how this superb division of color, like the superb division of the space is made in terms of where the figures are situated and how that is in a stark contrast with the background. So this is there, and the other thing that we can also think about in terms of that what the wood engraving does. So in terms of all the small lines that we see, that these horizontal lines which is there, and then for this dhoti we have all this curvy, this wavy lines here. So all these different kind of lines, and then all those motifs in the kurta, here in this sari, and here of course in this mat, and in the temple, in the pillar, and everywhere else. So all this linear ornamentation, something that we can see as part of the engraver's work, something we also see in the work of the jewelers. So those kind of things are there much more prevalent. So those things will be in a very different if it is done in the lithographic technique or in the etching technique. So those are some of the things we find, that how particularly the wood engraving technique for the Battala images had served the purpose well. And as we have also seen that these images were meant for mass consumption, that's the reason that the images also needed to be clear enough for people to appreciate them from a distance, and then they need to be bold enough for people to see them, that and to catch attention of the viewers. So the subtlety and the kind of the depth and the details and everything, those we have seen in some of the European prints. It's not really the people in the the indigenous printers would not have that kind of skill to execute those images, but they are making these images for a very different context. The boldness that we see in these wood engravings are meant to attract the clientele, to make their mark in the market, and that is the reason we find that how there's the space division, use of bold forms, and then bold and solid forms, and the use of ornamentation and everything else is implied here in the Battala prints, and how that works very differently from the landscape images that we have seen in the earlier part of the lecture. So from Battala prints we will go further, and so then we also see in the 19th century there are lithographic presses which gained prominence. So we see the lithographic presses there in the city of Calcutta, we see that in Bombay, in Pune, and also in Lucknow, Delhi, and Lahore. So here are some of the images that we see, and that is specifically I wanted to focus on these images. Those are called the Tugra lithographs, and they also appear in Paula Sengupta's research. And as we see that the Tugra lithographs are the ones in which we have the calligraphy that is formed as an animal. So that is something that we see as this Tugra lithographs. So the lithographic technique is something that we have already discussed, and this is the planographic technique, in which on this lithographic stone the images are drawn with greased based material. So that can be something like printing ink, that can be a greased based crayon and things like that, and then those images are printed onto paper. So for lithographic images we find that different kind of lines, different kind of tonalities were possible. So the kind of tonality we would never get in wood engraving or in metal engraving, like the half tone, but at the same time the kind of the straight lines, bold lines and everything that we also find in the wood engraving can be possible in lithograph. So lithograph gives actually a range of possibility for the printers to work with, and that is the reason in lithograph we find that in the many experiments have been done in the lithographic technique. But one thing also is there, that lithograph is a highly laborious process, and since it is done on lithographic stone and then the lithographic press and everything else is required, so it's also a very specialized technique. It is not something that can be done without a workshop setting. So what we see in this Tugra lithographs, and before the Tugra lithographs I can also just indicate to some of the other printing activities. So this one, in the left side of the screen we have this book which was published from Lucknow, and that is called the Jazb al-Qulub ila Diyar al-Mehboob. So that means the attraction of the hearts to the house of the beloved. So one can imagine that this is a devotional book, and then the entire book is printed in the lithographic technique. So this is the one, this is the cover page of the book, in which we see that how different kind of ornamentation, different this calligraphy, and some of the writings are in bold alphabets, whereas there are also really minute details. So all those different kind of images can be made in the lithographic technique, and that is what we were talking about, that how lithograph gave a wide range of possibilities for the printers to work with. Now coming back to the Tugra lithographs, what we find here, that here is this image of a tiger and a hawk, and so this images, so this image in the image of the tiger, and here we see that how this tiger stands on a landscape, and this hilly landscape we have, and then there is a Islamic architecture in the background, where there are two minars and then one dome, this high dome is depicted. So these are some of the things that we find, that how the writing and images, they sort of came together, and each of these images would also be framed within this this carefully made frames, the visual the markers of the pictorial spaces. So this is something that we find, that how this Tugra lithographs were also, a lot of these times they were also functioning as the broadsheet prints, as the Battala prints. So this, and one can see that they are these images, sometimes they people would also believe that they have talismanic power, and also they are the devotional images. So they are the ones within these frames, those will be collected by the devotees, and sometimes they will be framed in the wall and kept in the houses for the protection as well as for the prosperity of the residents. So that is something we find, that here, that how the images of the devotional images, both in terms of in both religious context, in Hindu, in Muslim, so how those images have operated in the 19th century markets, and that can be in Calcutta, that can be in Delhi, in Lahore and places like that. And this one, the one here in the right corner of the screen, we have this hawk by Mumtaz Dehelvi, and this is perhaps, that means that it was printed in Delhi. And so this is a particular Tugra lithograph that we see, and which is a chromolithograph. So the difference between a regular lithograph and a chromolithograph will be, in a regular lithograph we have just one color, and in one color you can have tonality, but it will essentially be just one color. So in this one is just monochromatic lithograph, and in this one we see it's a chromolithograph. And chromolithograph, for what happens is that this outlines are printed from one stone. So perhaps this entire bird is made in this one lithographic stone, and then this hawk is also killing this pigeon like bird. So this is something that this entire outline and perhaps some of the details of the grasses, those are made from one stone, and then the rest of the colors are done in different stones. So this yellow would be done in one stone, the blue in the upper part of the image would be done in another stone, and that is how the same stone, after having this particular the contour of the image, after that is printed, then that will be the same paper will be taken to the another lithographic stone where this yellow area is made. It will be printed, and then afterwards it will also be printed with the other lithographic stone where the blue areas are made. So that is how one single piece of paper would be printed several times, and that is how one chromolithograph print will be produced. So this is, as I have said, that this is a very laborious process, but once you have the stones ready, then you can make more than 100 reproduction of the same image. So that is the reason, even though the initial process of making or preparing these lithographic stones can be thought as laborious, but this has become a preferred medium of expression, a preferred medium of image making for a large group of printers in the Indian subcontinent. So this is something we find, that how these devotional images were printed, but at the same time there were different other kind of images were also made as this in this chromolithograph technique. So from there we can see that how there were certain ways in which the transference of knowledge of printing was happening. So for example, this one we see in the left side of the screen, we have this particular image which was drawn by Captain Grindlay, and then it was engraved by R.G. Reeve, and then it was colored by H.B. Hogarth. So this is something, it's called the Scene in Bombay, and it is etching, aquatint and hand coloring. So in etching we have already discussed that what kind of technique it requires for making the etching prints. And then for aquatint, what happens, there is a little more of technique that is involved there. So aquatint is basically, it's a process in which resin is melted on the top of the etching plate, and that is how those small pores are sort of created. And then instead of having the lines on the etched surface, in aquatint one can cover up certain areas like patches and keep the rest of the area for acid white, and when that happens the entire area gets a patch like watercolor, and that is the reason it is called as aquatint. So aquatint is also essentially, it's a monochromatic process in which tonalities can be achieved. But the thing is that in this one as well, that one cannot really have multiple plates for having the multiple colors in the same image surface. So in this one we see that what was happening in terms of the technique, that someone would be drawing it, and then someone else is engraving and etching it, and then someone else would be printing them, and someone else is adding the colors at the end. So that is how the entire image is produced. And as I have said that this kind of images would be much more prized, and they are made in this slow process. So they are they operate in a very different kind of circle than the mass produced images in the Indian subcontinent. So if this is one kind, and then we can see how when the indigenous printers, they were learning the technique from the Europeans, but they were also looking into these tonalities, and then how to imbibe that tonality into the subject matter which are relevant for the people in the Indian subcontinent. So we see that in terms of the color scheme, in terms of like the space division, in terms of like the depth and everything else, those things, a lot of those things what we see in the image in the left are also reflected in the image in the right. However, if we see it closely, then we find that this image is a very specific one for the Indian people, and it is made by an Indian printer instead of having this elaborate printing practice in having this elaborate process from drawing to printing. So what is happening in the image in the right side is we see this particular scene that is called Vijaya, and this is a scene in which we see that goddess Durga, she is taking her leave from her parents' home, and her mother is not ready to let her go with her husband, and that is Shiva. And we see that Shiva is standing at the corner, at the left corner of this image, and then in the lap of Shiva we see the child Ganesha is also there. So we see that how Shiva is placed at the left corner, and then he is waiting for goddess Durga or Uma to leave with him, and then like all the women in her mother's house, and they are not ready to let her go. And this is a very specific story that is associated with the festival of annual festival of Durga Puja in Bengal, where it is believed that goddess Durga or Uma, she visits her parents' home during the festival for 4 days, and at the end of the festival she goes back to her husband, and they travel back to the Himalayas. So this is a scene that we find that is very specific in Bengal, and this entire scene would only make sense to perhaps the Bengali audience who are well versed in this story. But if we think about the kind of the aesthetic choices, like the color scheme, the depth and everything else, those things we see them highly influenced by the European image making conventions. Now at the same time we also see something else here, and that is the use of anatomy. This masterful use of anatomy that we see, it is in this particular figure, it's almost that Shiva is standing in this contrapposto position, which we definitely do not see usually in the images of the Indian gods and goddesses. So that is something that we can find that since this is in the 19th century, in the late 19th century this image is produced, so by that time they have access to the education in European artistic anatomy, and also the study of the different kind of images that we can think about, and the marble sculptures and everything else. So from there this particular mode of representing human bodies is imbibed here in this image. So and also apart from just the representation of the figure, we also see this flowing drapery. So this drapery that we see here in the that is flowing here in the arm of Shiva, And then here also, like I mean, how goddess Durga or Uma and her mother, they also are draped in this flowing draperies. That is also something we find that to have its perhaps its connection to the Greco-Roman attire, and how that had also of course that also had its influence in the 19th, in the 18th and 19th century European sculptures. So how those conventions were brought into a subject matter which is only appreciated or perhaps understood by the Bengalis. So there is this layered hybridization that we can see that is taking place in these images here. And in terms of the technique, what we find is that it's a hand tinted chromolithograph. So there are certain parts of the image is made in lithographic technique, and one can certainly imagine that the contour lines, the areas which has the depth, and the colors which are much more prominent. So those were perhaps been printed in lithograph, and then the lighter tones perhaps, and the tones which are not used uniformly all over the surface. So those are perhaps the one which are later on added by the apprentices. So that is how it has chromolithograph as well as hand coloring. So this techniques that we find, that it's an amalgamation of both printing and use of stencil or hand coloring, something that we find in the European prints. Those were also implemented in these prints made by the indigenous printers. And this particular print that comes from this particular this press called Calcutta Art Studio, which was established in the late 19th century by Annoda Prasad Bagchi. And Annoda Prasad Bagchi was himself was an artist and who practiced oil painting, and then he was also involved in this printing activities, and he was trained in the Government School of Art in Calcutta. And that is how we can understand that how this different modes of image making were coming together in this image here. So in terms of all these images, we can see that some of these local aesthetics, those were those had its influence on the image making conventions. And for example, some of the images like this ones. So in this one there are the two representation of goddess Kali, and so this is goddess Kali and goddess Tara, and they are the ones who are considered to be part of this 10 Mahavidyas. And this is also a theme that we find it to be much more celebrated in Bengal than many other parts of India. So the localized version of these stories, or the localized versions of devotion that we see to be reflected in these images here. And then the localized version of these stories would also have the specific iconographic conventions, and then how that the established iconography, the localized version of devotion, and then all these things are represented through a medium of expression which is essentially European. So there are different layers in which we find these images are produced, and there are layers in which we find that how these images were appreciated and read, and how they have been part of the visual culture and public memory of the Indian subcontinent. So in this case, what we see the details, so these are also the images which are made in the chromolithography technique, and perhaps two lithographic stones are used for making the images of Kali and Tara, both of them. But again we can see that in the one piece of paper how these two images are printed. And of course here we see there is a wide range of colors, and I have already mentioned that the papers which are used here, these are mostly mill made papers, these are not the handmade papers. So those are smooth, and then like they would be much thin, and then they are cheaply produced. So these are the kind of papers that we are talking about here, and then the same paper would go through like different stages of production, and different this printing stages, the different stages of printing it will also go through, and that is how these images are produced. Now what we also see here is very significant, is that how the particular references to the storytelling had also been imbibed. So these images, even though we consider them to be as broadsheet prints, and as we can see that this entire image is perhaps been then framed by the devotees at their home, for either for worshipping or mostly for worshipping them. But the thing is that these images were not really just made as separate entities. So a counterpart of these images would probably be also be existing in some of the well-known stories. So in the Battala region, we also see that there were some of the more popular stories, and the popular stories for children, popular stories for young adults, and so on. Those will be in circulation, and then by this time in the late 19th century, we also see that the printed version of the Hindu epics like Ramayana and Mahabharata were also in circulation. So in some of the in those books, in the story books as well as in the devotional books, we will also find that the color plates would be there. So either that would represent episode from the entire narrative, or that would have a representation of a deity like the ones that we see on screen here. So that is the reason why we also see that this kind of images were not just not just produced as separate entities, but they were their counterparts were also made as part of the book illustration. So we'll continue more on these issues in the next lecture. Thank you.